Donc, Jonathan est professeur à l'Université de Paris, hein, anciennement Paris 7, et donc il travaille, travaille sur la modélisation du discours dans un cadre formel. Il a collaboré avec Ivan Sag dans le cadre du modèle HPSG, et donc là, il va nous présenter ses travaux donc plus récents sur le dialogue, et il a beaucoup écrit notamment sur la modélisation des questions-réponses. Donc, Jonathan, on te donne la parole. Donc, la conférence sera en anglais, mais donc vous pouvez poser vos questions en français si vous voulez.
Et je viens de remettre dans le chat le lien vers les diapositives que Jonathan nous a envoyé tout à l'heure pour les personnes qui viennent d'arriver, ainsi que l'article. Donc voilà.
Ok, très bien, merci beaucoup. Je suis désolé que je ne peux pas être en présentiel avec vous, mais c'est comme ça. Ce travail est travail que j'ai fait ensemble avec des collègues, des étudiants, des doctorants, Zulip Pujang, Chiluang Li, Keshin Ren, Alexander Kucharska et mon co-auteur Paweł Wódkowski de Poznan. OK, so je passerai en anglais. Donc, relevance in the sense of conversational coherence. You see an example here in one. Is that chair new? So there are basically two classes of responses that you can give. The one these ones, you see my arrow? You see the arrow that I'm, yeah, okay. Yes. So these ones, these are intuitively relevant to the question. Yes, it's a Louis XIV replica or new. Whereas these are not obviously somehow relevant to this question, unless maybe there's some, maybe some other prior concept, but usually this is not, these sort of without a good context, you wouldn't recognize these as relevant. So relevance, I would say, is a cornerstone of theories of dialogue, in the same way, perhaps, that grammaticality is to syntax. So it's sort of one of the most basic notions that any theory of dialogue, also of coherent text coherence too, for the case of monologue, which we'll get to later on. In fact, you might argue, as Turing did, that the ability to evince relevance is approximately is a plausible test for intelligence. So I'll kind of sketch you first a basic program for characterizing dialogical relevance. The first one is what you see here as in a slightly grandiose way, rest space of query for two persons. In other words, characterizing relevance for queries and their responses in two-person conversation. And the basic idea is that this involves two exercises. One, response space that is specific to queries, and the other is more specific to utterances in general. So the idea is, and this is going to be, I'm going to spend most of today talking about the stage one part. And then I'll, at the end, talk a little bit about stage two, which is extending this characterization to assertions or inform acts or whatever. I mean, there are all sorts of names for such a, and I mean, depending on your perspective on this, but basically these, yeah, I mean, basic acts of informing using typically declarative clauses or things of the propositional elements. So the idea is basically that, again, this to characterize the class of responses that to such moves involves something that is specific to those moves, plus again stuff that is kind of fairly general to any kind of move. So basically, the stuff that you've done from this stage will carry over to this stage, and then you can proceed from this to other moves like commands, exclamations, and so on. And so ultimately, you get from this a response for the whole space of dialogue moves by basically taking the stuff that's specific to particular moves, plus stuff that is more generally available as responses to any kind of utterance. And then, I mean, so this, of course, is not the end of the story. I mean, so, and again, even what I'm mentioning here is not the end of the story, but basically, at least one additional thing that one has to ultimately to do is also to extend this to multi-party dialogue, where of course there are other kinds of it's a somewhat richer kind of form of interaction, in a sense. For instance, there's turn-taking moves that are not really existing in a two-person interaction, or much less. And well, yeah, I mean, multi-party dialogue is a somewhat different form of interaction than two-person dialogue, and is not a simple kind of sum of two-person dialogues. I guess this is fairly well known. And then one can also try and consider whether there's also this sort of exercise applies to monologue, and even to maybe what you might call text, written text, which itself, of course, is multi-genre. There are things like letters, press releases, and so on and so forth. And so in the end, I'll mention a kind of hypothesis, which I mean, I would have thought this is not original with me, but if you know of any references that of somebody who's made this hypothesis before, I would be happy to know, because it seems a pretty obvious one. That the response space for such a case, in other words, what's the next, in a sense, what's a possible next sentence in a monologue, is a kind of a subcase of the response space of a two-person. I'll give just a few hints that might be the case, but of course this is not again, it's by no means evident that is true. It could certainly be false. Okay, so that's the basic program. And today, as I said, I'm going to mostly talk about this part, the query two-person response characterization. Briefly about this, and even more briefly about this part. But I think ultimately this part actually interests many more people in the world, I think. Well, I don't know how you count these things, but there's a lot more people working on characterization of coherence of text than the coherence of dialogue. Again, this is maybe, I'm not sure how true this is, but I think it's probably true, because of course it's much more easy to work on coherence of text, given that there's so much more text than there is sort of dialogue that you can work with in terms of empiric. Okay, so that's the basic plan. So the starting point for this work is work that Pavel Vupkovsky and myself did a few years ago, where we developed a typology for responses of questions to questions, right? So if you ask a question and a respond, so you ask a question and you can, a question can always be responded with a question. And we developed this taxonomy based on work in the British National Corpus, Childs, the B corpus, the Amex corpus, and to a certain extent also, though actually this didn't appear in the original paper, the Cornell movie corpus, and the spokes corpora in Polish, which is kind of like the the Polish national corpus, as far as I understand. And this work by Paweł and myself, in addition to also providing a empirical characterization, also offered formal modeling of the taxonomy in the framework of COS, which itself is COS TTR. So it's a formalism that I've worked with a number of colleagues over by now quite a few years. And in particular, this work is exposed in a monograph I wrote, again, by now not so recently. Yeah, okay. So that's sort of the basis for some of this work. And so today's work is based on on a sample of about 1,800 query response pairs, but actually originally the original work was based on a slightly smaller sample of about 1,200 query responses, and I made a small mistake here. But basically, the conclusion that we came to in the work on query responses to queries was that there existed basically 7 classes of questions that a given query gives rise to. And they are the following. So one is clarification requests, things like you see here. What's Hamlet about? Hamlet? They're dependent questions. So things like, does anybody want to buy an Amstrad? Are you giving it away? So in this case, these, by the way, these references are to where the examples come from in the British National Corpus. So dependent questions are cases where you ask one question and you get another question as a response. And a dependent question is a question where you can usually, to test this, you can sort of put the 2 questions in this sort of frame. And so in this case, you can answer it with, are you giving it away? Because you get this basic inference. Whether anybody wants to buy an Amstrad depends on whether you're giving it away. So that's a second class of possible query responses. A third class is what we call motive or motivation responses. So like, what's the matter? Why? Sorry, wrong. Sorry. Yeah, somebody asks, what's the matter? And the response is, why? In other words, why are you asking? Then another class is questions aimed at changing the topic. So A asks something like, yeah, what was your answer? And B says, what was yours? So they sort of, instead of answering this question, they kind of pose another question that they try to kind of push ahead of the queue in a way. A fifth class is a class that we called form. Questions that consider the way of answering. So, for instance, A asks the question: do we know where our main supply of our coffee is? And B responds, which country? As in, do you want to respond in terms of countries, or do you want to respond in terms of companies, or do you want to respond in terms of and so on and so forth. So that's fifth class. Sixth class is questions with a presupposed answer. So A asks, is your job safe? And B responds, well, whose job safe? So he's asking a question, but indirectly he is communicating no. And finally, the class that we called ignore, where the responses ignore the initial question, but address the same situation. So A asks something like, well, do you want to go down and have a look at that now while there's workmen there? And B says, why haven't they finished yet? So B isn't responding to the question itself, but it's as if he's sort of, he or she is observing the situation, and so it's ignoring it in ignoring the question in the sense of, but it's not like changing the topic exactly. It's different in the sense that the coherence comes from the fact that B is still observing the same situation that A posed. And as I said, of course, and as I guess Sylvain said at the beginning, if there are any questions about what I've said, don't hesitate to stop me at any point. I have the tendency to go too fast. So yeah. Okay. So the main hypothesis that we're making is that the response class to queries are responses. These were all classes of questions that occur as this sort of basically the full class of query responses to queries comes from these 7 classes. But our basic hypothesis about the entire space of responses to queries or questions is that they are responses drawn from these 7 classes plus direct and indirect answerhood. So that's our basic hypothesis. And you can see basically, you can see this basically here. So the question responses, they can get partitioned into 2 answers and non-answers. And among answers, we have the direct answers and the indirect answers. And among the non-answers, we have those that are in form of questions and those in the form of declarative utterances. So these are clarification requests, corrections, direct dependent questions, form questions that you saw before. All of these classes I mentioned before. Here we have an additional, a small additional class of cases. These are acknowledgements. These are cases, and I'll give examples in a second. Responses of the form I don't know. These are difficult to provide a response, and these again, these are the same class from here. So just to emphasize, acknowledgements is cases where speaker acknowledges that she's heard the question. Things like that's about it in it. I don't know is simply cases where person says I don't know. When's the first consignment of Scottish tapes? Don't know. And DPR, hard to provide an answer. Why? I'm not exactly sure. So ultimately, DPR, difficult to provide a response. This is a more general class than the IDK, but we sort of separated the IDK out because the IDK seems to be, I don't know, seems to be a very sort of important just class of utterances that occurs, sort of, I mean, even though logically this is a subclass of this is just so big that it's sort of almost it's kind of worth verifying on its own. Okay, so that's the basic taxonomy, and these are the corpora that we used were for English the British National Corpus, B, the map task corpus, and the Cornell movie corpus. As I'm sure most of you who work on corpora, most of these corpora are pretty familiar. The British National Corpus, of course, is a kind of as they call it, sort of like a balanced corpus that contains various topically understood conversations plus various conversations from various domains, a wide variety of domains. B is a kind of a task-oriented corpus containing tutorial dialogues from electronics courses. The map task from Edinburgh consists of dialogues recorded for direction providing task, and the Cornell movie corpus consists of film scripts.
Aussi pour le déjeuner.
Oui. Si tu veux, oui.
Non, mais pas.
Ben si, achète.
Et si je veux pas?
Excusez-moi, je crois qu'il y a quelqu'un qui a laissé son micro ouvert là.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, that was not a film script. Anyway, so basically, this we had in terms of the corpus that we used 500 query response terms from the BNC, 250 from B, 467 from the map task, and 678 from the Cornell movie corpus. And basically, the basic methodology was random turn selection of turn units ending with a question mark. So that's like the query. And from this, we then eliminated tag questions and turns with missing texts. Things that are, let's say, in the BNC are marked as unclear. And for Polish, we used data from the spokes corpus. As I mentioned, that's like the Polish national corpus. And this corpus consists of 2 million words, 247,000 utterances. And we randomly selected 25 files with 1,400 turns, and 694 question response pairs were used in the study. In all other, so that's the corpus we used. As for the results, so this is the results that you can see in terms of a bar chart. So this is in all corpora always. The largest by far class is the direct answers, 61% in the BNC, and close to 80% in task-oriented corpora like the map task, 60% in the Cornell movie corpus, which in itself is actually showing you that people who write film scripts are actually doing a pretty good job, in a sense that they're doing a pretty good job of simulating kind of spontaneous speech. And in the spokes corpus, 63%. Then the second biggest class is typically, well, there's some variation, but it's usually in the indirect answers. So it's 12% in the B corpus, 8% in the BNC, 13% in the Cornell movie corpus, 10% in spokes. And then clarification request is also, well, again, here as we go down in terms of frequency, there's more variation across corpora. So 8% in the BNC for clarification requests, much lower rate of clarification requests in map task and in B. And well, I guess in all the others, it's kind of a bit lower. Bit surprising, this difference between the spokes and BNC in this respect. You'd expect the a priori, you'd expect the frequency of clarification requests to be pretty similar among a corpus in English, a general corpus in English, a general corpus in Polish. I guess a possible explanation is that the BNC also has some more kind of task-oriented, well, some little bits that are this. So, but yeah, I mean, this is actually an interesting little puzzle for this big variation between Polish and English. Again, this is not maybe a huge. The Polish data amount is not huge, but anyway, this is a little puzzle. And what else? You can see that ignore is quite big. So it's about 4%. Ignore is the case, to remind you, is the case where one person asks a question and the other person doesn't address it, but kind of his or her response is about the same situation. So there's about 4% in the BNC, 6% map task, 4% B, close to 6% in Cornell movie script, and more than 6% in spokes. And what else? We have change topic, which again is not trivial anywhere. I don't know is again, you can see in the BNC it's about 4%. where it's almost completely negligible in the map task, and similar kind of percentages in the other corpora, a bit higher even in spokes. So that's Polish. Acknowledgements also pretty big. And if you want, in the form of a table here, you see some of the other classes. So let's see if there's anything else interesting. So you can see that difficult to provide a response is about half that amount of the I don't know. So I don't know is a much more bigger, on its own, much bigger than the rest of this kind of utterance. Let's see if there's anything else worth mentioning here from what I see from the data. Yeah, the dependent questions are about, as you see, 1.5% in the B and C. Yeah, again, so you see the Cornell movie the film scripts are actually not, this is doing a fairly good job of simulating, in many but not all cases, of simulating real speech. Change topic is more common in film scripts than in the BNC, for instance, by quite a big margin. What else? Yeah, so that's the basic data here. Let's see if there's anything.
Jonathan, I have a quick question regarding this table, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Yeah, so if you could go down to the table of percentages. So yeah, the percentages, the sum is per column, per corpus, right? Did you take a look also? Right. Did you calculate the percentages per line? Because it would be, I think it would be also interesting to compare the results to the respective proportions of each type of each response type.
I'm sorry, I'm not quite sure I understand the percentage of
the percentages per lines per response types. Because you took into account, in terms of proportions, you took into account like the columns, that is each corpus. And my question was, did you take into account also the proportions with respect to each response type? It would be nice to have some idea of the respective importance of each response type.
Yeah. I'm being very slow in understanding what you're after. So
we can come back later to this question later during question.
Okay, yeah. Maybe I'll manage to get my head wrapped around that.
Sorry about that.
So no, my fault for being slow. But yeah, I mean, of course, you could also be. Yeah, I mean, of course, these. Yeah, no. So we have given you at least. I mean, it's true that these numbers are at least, relative to different corpora. So you do see the differences. But yeah, I mean, it's. I mean, ultimately, there's some interesting things to look also, because here some of this data is a little bit too biased. But I mean, because of the direct answer getting so much of the mass. You miss out a little bit on the smaller classes, and at least in the paper on questions, we actually sort of, in the questions, the one that dominates is actually the clarification requests, and so there we actually did some work on at least in terms of displaying this of looking at the smaller classes in more detail. Than what you get here. Here you lose out because of all this mass that's concentrated in the direct answers. But yeah, anyway. So in terms of annotation reliability, we did an inter-annotator study, and 800 quick question response pairs were annotated by 2 advanced graduate students, computational linguists, both of whom I actually believe are in the audience. And they're both L2 speakers of English, extremely good speakers of English, but L2. And they underwent several training sessions with one of the authors, me. And then, so basically what we took from there was 622 from the first annotator, 730 from the second annotator. And as it happens, From these, we found about 500 commonly annotated response pairs. And the kappa for these was 0.65 and the Krippendorf 0.66. We looked a little bit about the cases where there was disagreements, 94 such cases. The main disagreements concerned 34 cases of direct answer versus indirect answer. Ignore versus change topic, acknowledgement, dependent question, and direct answer, and acknowledgements versus other. So as you can see, this is the direct answer versus indirect answer seems to be the biggest problem. And these occurred to a large extent with questions, why questions, how questions, and what is X doing questions, where the answers are by and large sentential. In the theoretical literature on why questions, for instance, and how questions, there's a fair amount of controversy exactly how to characterize such answers, right? Because given that they're sentential, it's not always so obvious to judge whether it's direct or indirect. So here's some examples. Here's why do they pretend not to know? Val, well, this is a new guy. So this is direct answer versus indirect disagreement, and resolved to be an indirect answer because somehow it seems to involve a certain amount of more inference than of inference. Sort of that's not just kind of straightforwardly linguistic. Here's another example. That's not very nice. It is. No, it isn't. Well, it is. Why isn't it? Because it isn't. And in this case, it was a disagreement over whether this was a direct answer or an ignore. And in the end, this was resolved to be an indirect answer since it indirectly indicates that there's no reason. Okay, so this is just giving you some examples for the disagreement analysis. And if you want, this is discussed in more detail in the paper that I gave you a link to. You have some more examples of these, both for and in Polish too. There's quite a bit discussion of that too. So now I'll move to talk a little bit about the formal analysis that is needed in order to characterize the response space to questions. So to extent that I guess the one thing, and rather important thing that I kind of missed out on was this class, which is the other class. In other words, the one that didn't fit in. And as you can see, the numbers are pretty good. Yeah, I mean, we have a fairly close to complete coverage with this taxonomy, plus some ambiguous cases that I've discussed now in terms of and I mean, in this respect, we're sort of following the line that has been recently pushed in the DALI project in University of Queen Mary in London, Queen Mary University of London, with the idea that ultimately one shouldn't expect to have necessarily a gold standard, but that actually ambiguity is potentially a legitimate kind of thing in classification. So the fact that you have ambiguous cases is not necessarily arguing against the taxonomy, but it could be that there are cases that are really genuinely ambiguous, given the contextual resources that the annotators have. And I mean, even in interaction, of course, we know that there's in genuine interaction, we know that ambiguity happens. Anyway, so given that that this taxonomy seems to more or less give a pretty reasonable characterization of the response space to queries, And given that in our paper, the original paper, the 2016 paper that we wrote, we gave formal rules that classify, that give an analysis of all of these classes, how they fit into this formalism, the cost formalism, how we can characterize coherence within them, then that gives you, in principle, a complete characterization of the response space for questions, potentially an implementable form. Some work on this has recently been done by in some joint papers with Vlad Muraev and Jean-Philippe Bernardi, and there's some a recent paper on this on my website if you're interested. Anyway, so the most basic notion of answerhood, okay, if we're talking about direct answers, is what you might call, or what we have called, simple answerhood. And that is the range of the propositional abstract. So if you think of a question as a propositional abstract, which is has always been my view, is sort of the null hypothesis of what a question is. So simple answerhood is the range of the propositional abstract plus their negations. So the simple answers to a polar question are the query proposition and its negation, and the simple answers to a WH question are the basic predications plus the basic instantiations plus their negations. Now, simple answerhood, though it has good coverage, is not sufficient. And the more general notion of answerhood is something that we've called aboutness. And aboutness is ultimately much more rich than just simple answerhood. So it needs to accommodate conditional, weakly modalized, and quantification answers, as the examples of which you can see in 7 here. So for a polar question, can I have some ice cream? Then you can do if there is any. So that's a conditional answer. Are you voting for Tory? I might. So that's like a modal answer, right? So these are both cases of direct responses to what I would say as direct responses to a polar question, which are neither the yes nor the no. These are this is an example of a quantified answer to a WH question, a non-instantiation. What did grandma have to catch? A bus. Where are you going to hide it? Somewhere you can't have it. Okay, again, which is not something, not necessarily one of these instantiations. So how to formally and empirically characterize aboutness? So the aboutness being the general notion of a direct answer is an interesting topic that there's been quite a lot of work on in the semantics of interrogatives, though ultimately I would say not enough. So there's still for those of you who are looking for a topic, and I know that those other people that I've seen in the audience who are working on this too. Comprehensive, empirically based, experimentally tested count for a variety of WH words is still elusive. Okay, so this is actually still very much of an, ultimately, surprisingly, you would have thought, but still a very open topic. Of course, an additional important notion that's a theory of questions needs is a notion of exhaustiveness. That's of course generally also like a pragmatically parameterized notion, whether response is exhaustive or what I call goal fulfilling can determine whether is either exhaustive or goal fulfilling, which are somewhat different notions, can determine whether the response will be accepted or whether it will require follow-up query. So we ultimately need a finer grained subdivision of the answer categories, which we kind of assume in the paper, but we don't actually give it because it's, it's just, as it were, there's already a fair amount of classes there. So no yes answers to polar questions and partial polar answers. So these are subclasses of the polar questions, simple answers to WH questions and partial answers to WH questions. So given a notion of aboutness and some notion of exhaustiveness, one can then define question dependence, which is needed for the class of dependent questions. And for instance, in these terms, Q1 depends on Q2 if any proposition that resolves Q2 also satisfies that it entails R such that R is about Q1. So basically what this notion of dependence is a notion that says that a question depends on another question if any answer that resolves the second question, the response that is provided as a dependent question, is a partial answer to the first question. So that's one possible notion of dependence one can define, but there have been lots of other proposals in the literature. And again, this is an open question. And once again, empirically, it's still something that hasn't been studied very carefully in terms of, giving a good empirical characterization of the class of dependent questions. And in fact, the original motivation for our study on query responses was exactly to give an empirical characterization of this class. And one of the problems in giving an empirical characterization of this class is exactly that there are lots of other classes of questions that you can respond as questions. So, separating out this class is not so straightforward, but given the work that we did, then we think that this class can now be sort of separated out and studied on its own. And then once you have notions of aboutness and dependency, then you can define rules for capturing the coherence of direct answers in dialogue. Rules of, for instance, of this form, what you see in 9 here, Q specificity. If Q is a question under discussion, then you can respond with an utterance R, which is Q specific. In other words, it's either a question about it's either a response about the question, in other words, a partial answer, or a question that is dependent on the original question. Sorry, a question on which the original question depends. So this is a rule that will capture the coherence of direct answers and dependent questions. Okay, so that's moving on to clarification requests and corrections. So in other work that we did, again, some years ago, we argued that this is a domain where logics that use simply contents of utterance are not adequate. And unfortunately, this is state of the art. That most logics that characterize coherence in conversation are just simply use the contents. But this is not enough for two main reasons. One is that the generation of clarification requests requires access to the entire sign associated with the given utterance. So the two basic reasons for this. One is that any constituent, certainly down to the word level, can be the object of an acknowledgement or clarification request or correction, as exemplified here in 10 for clarification requests. So this is an example of, from a time that might look a little bit historic by now. So this is George Galloway's recorded reassuring His Excellency Uday Hussein, the son of Saddam, if you remember this somewhat forgotten character by now. That I'd like you to know that we are with you till the end. Right? He said, I'd like to know we are with you till the end. Who did he mean by we? Who did he mean by you? And what end did he have in mind? He hasn't said. Okay, so all of these words are potentially clarifiable, this utterance. Another example, is the war salvageable? That depends on what we mean by the war and what we mean by salvage. Okay, so basically the point being that whenever you have an utterance, basically any part of the utterance can be clarified. So if you're generating the clarifications, you have to have some representation that from which you can access all of the words, and that's going to be typically richer than just the content. Moreover, as again discussed in some other work that we've done, the variety of parallelism constraints relating to the form of such utterances that require reference to the non-semantic representation of the utterance. So here's two examples, sort of as kind of like minimal pairs in a sense. Do you fear him or are you afraid of him, right? They basically mean the same thing. On the other hand, in this context, you can respond fear. What do you mean by fear, or why are you asking if I fear him? And you cannot respond afraid, or you cannot respond, what do you mean afraid? Whereas if you formulate this in this way, right, which is basically synonymous with this, but it just uses different words, then you have different clarification potential. So are you afraid of him? Afraid, or which means in this context, what do you mean by afraid? Or are you asking if I'm afraid of him? But you cannot respond fear, or what do you mean fear? Okay, so the actual words that you use are really important in characterizing the class of potential clarification responses. It's not something that's just based on content, and so therefore any account of the range of possible clarification requests has to have a representation that that is richer than just the content. And so in work by both Matthew Purver and myself, we showed how to account for the main classes of clarification requests using rules that enable clarification questions relevant to given utterance to be accommodated into the context. Again, without going to formal details, such rules can be specified as what you see here in 12. So basically the form of clarification context update rules is what you see in 12. We have some as an input an utterance, an utterance U by A, and U1 is a constituent of U. And so they're basically three classes, potential classes that seem to be needed for characterizing the clarification questions that occur in conversation. One class is, what did A mean by U1? What word did A utter at U1? So these are kind of for cases where you want to request a repetition. And for confirmation questions, what is U1's content, given that U's content is, so when we abstract the, given that U1's content is X, given that, yeah, this. So these are the basic form of rules for generating clarification requests and corrections. Now, moving on to evasion utterances. So these are all the classes that we saw before: the motive class, the change topic class, and the ignore class. So basically, our claim in our original paper, Pavel Wódkowski's and mine, was that basically what's common to all of these classes is that not accepting the original question for discussion, but nonetheless it remains in the context. So in these cases, in 13, you see examples where you have either a motive query or a change topic query. Who are you meeting next week? What's in it for you? Or who are you meeting next week? Right? These are two. So this is a motive query and this is a change topic query. And the dialogue continues. I'm curious. Whatever. Oh, okay, Jill. Okay. So this is a case where ultimately an answer is given to this question, even though it wasn't actually accepted for discussion. So somehow this is giving you some basic constraint about the analysis of these kind of moves, that it's telling you that somehow nonetheless, even though the question is not accepted for discussion initially, it kind of doesn't get thrown away. It kind of gets added into the context in some way or other. And then, yeah, extra things happen. So a bit more concretely, basically, cases like I don't know and motive questions can be viewed as responses that are specific to the issue. Does B want to respond to the question Q, where Q is the original question that's asked? Whereas for change topic, the response is constrained, is constrained to be unifiable via a question, by some additional question. So typically when you change the topic, what happens is that this doesn't always hold, but this seems to apply to many such cases, is that there's some sort of, you respond with another question or another utterance about that question, which is somehow connected to the original question, in the sense that you can somehow find a third question which kind of unifies the two. So for instance, if the first question is what do you like, and the response is what do you like, then the unifying question is something like who likes what. As for ignore, our original analysis suggested that somehow this simply involved the second question having a shared situation with the question Q1. An alternative formulation the one that we give in our current paper involves somehow sharing at the level of the each participant's audiovisual field. Okay, so I think I'll skip this slide, but okay. So far, okay. So just so basically, what I've done in the last 13 slides was I just gave you some kind of hints for the kind of stuff that you need in a theory in order to give a characterization of the entire class of responses to questions. What are the basic ingredients that such a theory needs to have, and how it can basically do it. So basically it's done in terms of either having some basic theory of answers, or having a means of injecting new questions into the context. In the case of clarification requests, the new questions that get injected into the context are basically arising from this schema. In the case of the evasion responses, then different kinds of questions get injected. In the case of the motive questions, you inject this question, and you always have the potential to inject this question into the context. In the case of change topic, via some kind of unification operation, then you can calculate possible other questions that you can inject. And the ignore case is a very open kind of operation, but it's constrained still by being a question that relates to essentially a shared situation. Okay, so that's what I want. That's sort of the sort of the formal story about characterizing responses to questions, to queries. Now to the final kind of much more speculative part of the talk. So as far as assertion-specific moves, so this part is not yet empirically grounded, so we haven't really done any significant corpus study yet on this part. But the basic account that in our framework we've had for analyzing assertions in dialogue is that they involve, I mean, it's pretty obvious thing to say, that an assertion basically involves two branches, either an acceptance branch or a discussion branch. Acceptance is the familiar thing that happens in most dynamic theories of semantics, in the sense that you add the proposition you accept into some kind of common shared assumptions or something. Discussion is a discussion of the corresponding polar question that comes out of an assertion. So the basic claim that we make, or that I make, because the authors of our original paper haven't seen any of this and might not buy any of this. But the basic claim is that all the issues that we've seen so far that get added into context potentially as a consequence of query are also applicable in discussing the response space of an assertion with some minor modifications. So for instance, instead of a direct answer option, there's the discussion of the issue, the corresponding polar question. So Bill arrived late last night. He did not. Okay, so basically what this is saying is that, as soon as an assertion is made, then we always have the option of responding with any response about the question whether Bill arrived late last night. And an additional and crucial assertion-specific move is acceptance, like you see here. We shall go back after Easter, yes, or I agree, right? A makes this whole move here, and B responds by I agree. And additional kind of move is after acceptance, a request for elaboration. That's the last time he saw Ricky as well. He's never been in contact. Are you expecting a problem from him? Okay, so these are, you accept it, and as a consequence, you ask some questions elaborating about the situation discussed. Now, in addition to this, so of course, as I'm sure you all know, there's a lot of work in various sorts of frameworks for characterizing essentially text, but text or monologue, using rhetorical relations. So there are various moves that have been proposed, like explanation, a relation that holds between two what one might call declarative or rhetoric moves, manner, narration, and all of these can be also kind of applied to conversations. So, for instance, if A says they decide to leave the EU, then you can follow that up by saying why. And in other words, why did they decide to leave the EU? So that's kind of the background for an explanation. So this is a kind of a question option in this case, but you could also, you know, a move. You could equally have a rhetoric move that would be able that explaining why they did this, and equally we need to fix the problems this has caused. How? Okay, so this is a kind of like a manner relation. And here we have a narration, so how a narration occurs interactively. There might be a big crisis on January 1st, 2021, and then a big crisis 3 months later, and then, so basically we can characterize all of these kind of, dialogically, we can characterize these rhetorical relations as has been proposed by other authors, for instance, Andy Kaler and Katya Jasinskaya, in terms of rules of this form, where we have as a maximal question of discussion some polar question, and the effect is allowing us for moves which are specific either to the corresponding why question, the corresponding how question, or the corresponding what follows after the situation associated with this proposition. Okay, so this was assertion-specific moves. Finally, we have monological moves. So most dialogical moves are applicable also to monologue, and by monologue I also mean text. So let's say if you're writing a text, all of these are possible cases. So for instance, the I don't know case, you can write a text like this. What can we do about the current situation? Frankly, I don't know. Clarification, request, or correction. Biden is a great candidate. What do I mean? Or Biden is a great candidate. I mean, he's much better than his predecessor, right? Motive. Trump has bowel problems. Who gives a fuck, right? So that's a kind of, again, maybe not in a very polite text, but, in a more kind of, social network type text. Who should we vote for? I don't really want to discuss this here, but if push comes to shove, Sanders, right, for instance. So these are all of these essentially dialogical moves are equally possible in the text. But not all dialogical moves are applicable to monologue. So for instance, the context created by interaction between two personas, not necessarily two distinct individuals, is distinct from monologue. So it's kind of, whereas you can have an ignore move in two-person interaction, it's really strange to have an ignore move in a monologue, right? Biden is an awful orator. What's the weather in Nome today, right? So in a two-person interaction, that's of course a possible A can say this and B can say that as a way of kind of telling them that they don't want to discuss this, a classical kind of Gricean kind of move. But in a monologue or in a text, right, you can't have kind of like this this sort of sequence. In other words, you don't get the effect that you get in a dialogue. Let's not talk about this first move. Okay, so like an ignore, it doesn't seem to be a thing that occurs in a monologue. And certain clarification requests. So if you write Biden is a great candidate, Biden. So that's a possible, it is a possible thing you can write. But if you write it, it's not going to get this meaning, who's Biden, right? In a two-person interaction, of course, that's the most obvious. Well, at least one of there's two obvious readings for this, right? Do you mean Biden or who's Biden, right? In two-person interaction. But if you write this in a text by yourself, you could this could be taken to mean, did I really want to say Biden? But it can't mean this, right? So this is showing you that, of course, that you can't just reduce kind of like a monologue and a dialogue are not kind of like interreducible in this sense. And again, in a single text, when a single authored text, who can solve these difficult problems? Why? Again, this why can't get the meaning. Why am I asking? Which it could get in a two-person interaction. Okay, so the challenge, of course, is to derive the differences from the difference in terms of sort of what's happening in interaction as opposed to a single move building of a text. So it's an open question. How does monologue differ from internal dialogue? Which, for instance, there's been some work on internal dialogue, for instance, in a paper by Marcus Kracht. And of course, internal dialogue inner dialogue is of course very important for therapeutic applications. There are lots of recent work by psychologists about how the nature of inner dialogue can make very big. If you change the way you do your inner dialogue, it can fix some of your psychological problems. So inner dialogue, of course, is an important thing that, again, is as far as I know, very much understudied by linguists. Okay, so I'm pretty much done. Basically, the conclusions, or rather the summary. So I gave you a pretty detailed characterization of the response space to queries in two-person interaction, suggesting that this is a kind of the first step towards a characterization of the entire response space for two-person interaction, which is built out of some kind of characterization of each type of move plus the response space of a class of moves that are basically applicable to any kind of move. And I made this basic hypothesis that the response space for like a monologue is a subclass of the response space of two-person interaction. Obviously, this is by no means, this is just hypothesis, and of course it could be easily refuted. But this at least gives some principled and well-studied basis for giving characterization of the class of discourse coherence relations. What I didn't discuss today is what you might call non-verbal relevance. So how to integrate into an account of dialogue coherence moves like laughter, smiling, eyebrow raising, frowning. So we have a recent paper where we talk about exactly how to the importance, the fact that laughter, that these moves like laughter, smiling, and eyebrow raising, and so on, they are moves that have propositional content and deserve to be accommodated in an account of dialogue in the space of possible responses to other dialogue moves. And we know, of course, that they're very, I mean, we know from for instance, from recent social work and from the fact from what happens in social media that people do need, right? The fact that you have emojis and stuff like that means, and people use them a lot, suggests that these kind of things are kind of important in general. And another thing that I haven't talked about at all is what one might call language game variability, or in other words, domain specificity, or the fact that interaction is different across, you have different kind of moves in a courtroom and in an auction and in examination by a doctor, and so on and so forth. And that also has to be integrated into this account. Okay, so I'll stop here, and I think maybe there are questions in the chat. I'm not sure. I didn't.
Not yet.
Okay. Not yet. Okay, good. Yeah.
Thank you, Jonathan. Est-ce qu'il y a des questions? Are you willing to take questions in French?
Of course.
Mm-hmm. Donc, on peut poser ces questions en français ou en anglais, comme vous voulez.
Moi, je peux commencer par une question un peu générale sur le... Donc, au début, tu as proposé une classification avec 7 classes. Et donc, finalement, je me demandais quels étaient les présupposés théoriques derrière qui faisaient qu'on arrivait à cette granularité. C'est-à-dire qu'on aurait pu imaginer qu'on pourrait avoir plus de classes ou moins de classes suivant les critères qu'on prend en compte. Et finalement, quels sont les critères qui sont pris en compte pour obtenir cette classification? Et une question qui est un peu liée, c'est finalement comment ces 7 classes sont, est-ce qu'elles sont toutes au même niveau, ou est-ce qu'il y a certaines classes qui en fait forment ensemble des classes plus importantes, ou est-ce que, enfin, comment se situe cette granularité?
Ok, les 7 classes, on peut dire que c'est une caractérisation empirique. C'est qu'est-ce qu'on apprend d'une étude ou des études des corpus. Et donc, cette question donne un défi théorique c'est-à-dire, il donne une caractérisation empirique de l'espace de réponse possible. Et il nous donne un défi qu'on doit caractériser formellement. Donc, oui, c'est qu'on... Je crois que c'est pas possible de donner une... Oui, donc donc la théorie doit fournir une caractérisation de comment ces questions arrivent, mais pourquoi cette question, ces questions, oui, c'est-à-dire, j'ai essayé dans la deuxième partie de la conférence d'expliquer comment on peut, pour chaque type de question, expliquer sa pertinence. Mais surtout, cette question, c'est un peu une découverte un peu empirique, je peux dire. Et la deuxième question, est-ce que j'ai répondu?
Oui, et du coup, comment s'organisent ces 7 classes? C'est-à-dire, si tu devais réduire la granularité, par exemple, si tu devais faire 3 classes, comment tu organiserais les choses? Est-ce qu'il y a des choses qui sont en fait reliées, des choses qui sont vraiment différentes?
Oui, en fait, ok, je n'ai pas le fait ici. Dans notre article, il y a un peu de, comme je l'ai fait ici dans la deuxième partie de la conférence, avec on caractérise la pertinence en utilisant de règles conversationnelles Et donc, par exemple, ici, on a par exemple, c'est une règle conversationnelle QSpec qui, on peut, en utilisant ces règles, cette règle, on peut à la fois caractériser la pertinence de questions, des réponses,
You can answer in English if
answer, comment dire answer?
Réponse?
Non, the difference between response and answer. Ça, c'est ce que je cherche. Je ne sais pas si en français, il existe en différenciation entre response and answer. Response, answer, reply. Donc, je ne sais pas. En tout cas, on peut, en utilisant cette règle, on peut à la fois caractériser la pertinence de direct answers et dependent questions. Parce qu'il semble que normalement, oui, c'est utile parce que toujours, on peut à la fois soit donner en réponse directe, soit donner en question soulevant. Donc, ça, c'est un exemple. Ici, il y a la pertinence métacommunicative. Donc, on les caractérise en utilisant de schémas de ce type. Et ici, mais je ne donnais pas ici les règles pour le evasion responses, mais c'est aussi, donc, dans notre théorie d'un cause, on caractérise tout en utilisant les règles conversationnelles qui sont, oui, c'est un peu comme analogie avec la syntaxe, c'est un peu comme phrase structure rules. C'est-à-dire, comme on a un ensemble de phrase structure rules dans la grammaire. En grammaire, ici, il y a une suite de règles conversationnelles qu'on peut utiliser pour caractériser la pertinence. Je ne sais pas si c'est moi, j'aime l'analogie, mais ce n'est pas forcément le cas pour tout le monde. Est-ce que j'ai répondu à la question?
Oui, en partie, oui, je vois. Il y a un certain nombre de critères derrière qui vont permettre de séparer les types de réponses. Mais ils étaient assez difficiles à comprendre en même temps, les deux critères là, que tu as montrés, là, 8 et 9. Pour moi je n'ai pas bien saisi. Je pense que pour beaucoup de gens, ça a été difficile de saisir.
Ok, ok. Peut-être, ok, excusez-moi. Non, c'est ma faute, bien évidemment. 8 et 9, ok. Non, ok. Ça, 8, c'est seulement un exemple d'une définition de la notion de dépendance entre questions. Donc ça, c'est une notion totalement, c'est une relation sémantique pure, on peut dire. Tandis que ça, 9, c'est une règle conversationnelle qui on utilise pour, c'est-à-dire avec cette règle, on peut caractériser la possibilité de réponse que j'ai. Après que j'ai compris que vous m'avez posé une question, donc j'ai accepté votre question et donc je sais, ok, moi j'ai actuellement la possibilité soit de répondre avec une réponse qui est une partial answer, soit avec une question qui est qui est une question à laquelle la question originale dépend. Donc, ça, c'est un exemple d'une règle conversationnelle. Et par contre, si je n'ai pas totalement compris votre question, donc je peux utiliser une règle de ce type. Donc, j'ai reconnu que que vous avez fait un énoncé quelconque. Et donc, il y a peut-être, j'espère, j'ai un problème avec un mot que vous avez utilisé. Donc, je peux aussi répondre avec la question qu'est-ce que vous voulez dire par dire, je ne sais pas, dépendance. Donc, vous avez dit, mais pourquoi vous utilisez la notion de dépendance? Et j'ai un problème de dépendance, donc j'ai dépendance. Donc, ça, c'est un exemple d'une question de clarification qu'on peut lancer avec ce type de règle de clarification.
Ok.
J'ai une question aussi. Donc, merci beaucoup pour votre présentation. C'était très intéressant. Et donc, je vais me pencher plus pour lire un petit peu vos articles. Juste une question, peut-être vous l'avez dit, peut-être voilà, c'était peut-être rapide. Quand vous présentez les résultats statistiques donc des corpus annotés, est-ce que vous tenez compte de l'aspect, on va dire, l'aspect plutôt socio-linguistique, c'est-à-dire le contexte d'enregistrement, parce que je pense que la typologie va varier effectivement du contexte. Donc, quand on est dans, je ne sais pas, quand on mange pendant le repas, on parle d'une certaine manière, quand on est à la conférence, etc. Est-ce que ces résultats-là ne dépendent pas effectivement du contexte,
Tout à fait, tout à fait.
etc.
Non, tout à fait. Clairement, vous avez raison. Et comme je l'ai dit, je n'ai pas discuté du tout, par exemple, des questions de variabilité qui est liée au genre on se trouve dedans. Donc, oui, pour l'instant, c'est très, on peut dire, du point de vue statistique, c'est très gros. C'est-à-dire, c'est pas quelque chose. On utilise, par exemple, le BNC, donc c'est assez aléatoire. Donc, ça nous donne une idée, mais c'est clair qu'il y a grand variation. J'imagine, il y a, par exemple, on a dans notre article, l'article de Pavel Wojtkowski et moi, sur la réponse de question à question, on a comparé la distribution entre le BNC, le MapTask, le B, et aussi Child, par exemple, pour les enfants. Et on a vu qu'il y a une grande variabilité. C'était des classes un peu différentes, mais oui, même ici, on voit par exemple la différence entre direct answers, c'est beaucoup plus clair, c'est plus ça pèse beaucoup plus dans le corpus orienté vers tâches comme le MapTask ou B que dans le BNC, par exemple, qui est plus général. Et même dans le BNC, j'imagine qu'il y a différence entre, je ne sais pas, oui, interview politique, consultation chez un médecin, etc. Donc, mais on n'a pas fait ça. Et c'est quelque chose qui est vraiment... On doit le faire, clairement.
Oui, ça sera intéressant, je pense. Oui.
Sans doute.
Merci beaucoup.
Alors, dans l'ordre des questions, il y avait Maria Borichev qui avait posé une question et qui a plusieurs questions sur les définitions formelles des types de réponses. Je ne sais pas si Maria veut prendre la parole.
Il y a aussi des questions à Guillaume depuis un moment, mais bon.
Oui, tout à fait. Anne, excuse-moi, je les prends dans l'ordre, en fait.
D'accord.
Bonjour, merci beaucoup pour l'exposé. Déjà, c'est super pour nous de Nancy de pouvoir rejoindre comme ça Oui, et Maxime Amblard demandait de dire merci aussi. Il a dû partir, mais voilà, il était très content de pouvoir assister à l'exposé. Et nous, on a quelques questions sur les définitions formelles et sur les formalismes utilisés, notamment au niveau de la slide 23. Parce que donc vous avez défini la notion de réponse simple, donc avec cette question de l'abstraction. Et en fait, la question que moi je me pose, c'est comment compositionnellement se passe, comment est-ce qu'on peut calculer la composition d'une question avec sa réponse, puisque finalement, ça résolverait l'abstraction. Je ne sais pas si c'est des questions que vous avez traitées jusque-là.
Donc, ici, la notion de question simple answerhood, c'est dans le niveau de contenu. C'est-à-dire, c'est entre une question, c'est-à-dire que c'est question et proposition. Donc, c'est quelque chose qui est... c'est pas dans le niveau de composition grammaticale, si on peut dire. Oui, donc... oui, donc c'est quelque chose qui est seulement... c'est une abstraction de la processus compositionnel. Et je ne sais pas, ou je ne comprends pas pourquoi on veut mêler les deux. Mais peut-être je n'ai pas compris la question.
Non, merci. Je pense que sa réponse, c'est une question du niveau dialogique dans lequel on se place. Et je pense qu'on n'a pas la même perspective simplement sur les mouvements traités. Merci beaucoup.
Merci. Anne?
Oui, bonjour, merci beaucoup pour cet exposé.
Bonjour.
Alors, moi, en fait, je vais poser des questions dans la continuité de Sylvain et d'Iris. Donc, si je comprends bien, c'est une approche empirique sur corpus, donc les données, enfin, les catégories naissent des observations sur corpus. Mais du coup, effectivement, on peut se poser la question, si on vient sur vos premières stats, les stats que vous nous avez montrées tout à l'heure avec du rouge, du jaune et tout ça, on a envie de se dire, de faire un petit peu, on a envie de faire le tri là-dedans, de se dire que finalement, est-ce que toutes ces catégories sont pertinentes et de regrouper en sous-catégories peut-être et tout ça. Et finalement, effectivement, si on se pose la question des genres de discours, ce regroupement en catégories génériques et complètement abstrait, peut-être risque de ne pas être pertinent parce que les fréquences, ces fréquences-là, finalement, ne veulent pas dire grand-chose en soi, puisque si on ne prend pas, non pas la situation, mais le genre, et vous en avez parlé, les choses se répartiront de façon différente. C'était une de mes questions. Et l'autre question, c'est au début, votre arbre. Donc, c'est une question, mais je suis désolée, hein, moi, j'y connais rien dans sémantique formelle et en dialogisme. Mais je n'arrive pas à comprendre la division. Donc, si on peut revenir sur l'arbre, vous avez donc à gauche les vrais répondent.
Ça?
Ouais, donc les answers, donc DAIA, je ne sais plus ce que c'est que DAIA.
C'est direct answers, indirect answers.
D'accord, mais quelle est la différence entre les indirect answers et peut-être certaines choses qui sont dans vos non-answers?
Parce que indirect answer, c'est quelque chose qui implique une réponse directe. C'est une affirmation qui implique une affirmation directe, un direct answer.
D'accord. Ok. Et donc, du coup, là, dans les questions et déclaratifs, c'est vrai que toutes ces catégories, ça fait comme 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 catégories. Effectivement, on peut se poser la question, ça fait beaucoup quand même.
Beaucoup. Je ne sais pas. Si on peut caractériser tout l'espace de réponse à une question avec 13 catégories. En tout cas, le nombre ici, il n'y a pas une significance théorique parce que la théorie est un peu... Ça, c'est une caractérisation empirique.
Oui, c'est ça, tout à fait.
Donc, oui, peut-être on peut... Et oui, par exemple, comme je l'ai dit, par exemple, la classe, il y a des classes qui est clairement redondante. Par exemple, le IDK, d'un point de vue théorique, ça appartient à ces classes de Difficult to Provide a Response, mais vu le fait que c'est quelque chose qui arrive très souvent soi-même, donc on a choisi de le montrer comme ça.
Ouais,
Mais oui, c'est une présentation qu'on peut compress. Mais
non,
en
mais
tout cas, cette caractérisation empirique, c'est quelque chose que la théorie après doit expliquer.
bien
Donc
sûr,
ça, c'est une...
ça c'est super
Ça, c'est notre but. C'est-à-dire trouver d'abord une présentation empirique de faits et après trouver une théorie qui peut expliquer et générer toutes les réponses possibles.
Ok. Et dernière question, en fait, qu'est-ce que vous appelez la pertinence?
Mm-hmm.
Oui,
La pertinence, c'est seulement, c'est quelque chose de tout à fait peut-être flou, je ne sais pas, mais c'est quelque chose, c'est un peu, comme je l'ai dit, comme, je donnais ça, c'est-à-dire c'est une connaissance intuitive, peut-être on peut dire, qui nous permettent de différencier ces classes de réponses et ces classes de réponses. Pourquoi réponse demain is that question new? Is that chain new? Demain, ça semble un peu bizarre, et tandis que yes, c'est tout à fait possible c'est Louis XIV réplique, c'est aussi possible si on sait que ça c'est un type de chaise. Je sais pas.
Ok, donc ça n'a rien à voir avec la théorie de la pertinence, c'est juste...
Non.
D'accord, donc c'est une réponse appropriée, plus ou moins appropriée, c'est ça? D'accord, ok.
Exactement.
Je vous remercie beaucoup.
Merci Anne. Oui, on a eu beaucoup de questions sur le tableau de la slide 18. Et pour revenir à ma question tout à l'heure, c'était... moi, je serais curieux juste d'un point de vue statistique de base, de regarder un petit peu ce qu'il y a derrière les pourcentages.
Mm-hmm.
Parce que le sens de ma question, c'est que quand vous avez choisi les pourcentages dans ce tableau,
Mm-hmm.
vous avez fait un choix, c'est-à-dire que vous avez décidé de regarder les proportions par corpus. Et si on avait les fréquences brutes, ben, on pourrait regarder...
Ah, ok, je comprends. Oui.
Voilà. Et si on avait les fréquences brutes, on pourrait regarder donc les proportions par corpus, mais aussi les proportions par type de réponse. Et ça pourrait être
Oui.
Et effectivement, il y a beaucoup de
Non,
valeurs.
tout à fait. Oui, non, oui. Vous avez tout à fait raison.
Et ça pourrait être intéressant avec voilà, comment dire, une technique exploratoire. Ça pourrait être intéressant de regarder un petit peu voilà, quel type de réponse va être plus proche de quel type de corpus. Et inversement,
Oui.
on
Non,
pourrait,
tout à fait.
je pense, croiser beaucoup plus de choses. Et ça pourrait être. Ma question est venue vraiment de curiosité. C'est-à-dire que moi, ça m'intéresserait de voir véritablement dans les deux sens, un petit peu quels sont les schémas d'attraction et de répulsion qu'il y a à l'œuvre dans cette typologie qui est par ailleurs très intéressante.
Oui, mais je ne sais pas. Pour l'instant, on a fait ça d'une manière un peu dire amateur, c'est-à-dire le chiffre sont un peu, c'est-à-dire la manière de choisir, par exemple, qu'est-ce qu'on a ici? On a oui. les proportions sont pas choisies dans une manière très profonde, on peut dire. Donc, je crois que pour faire quelque chose un peu plus sérieux, pour bien comprendre les choses que peut-être vous intéresse, on doit peut-être le refaire un peu dans une manière un peu plus sage. Mais bon, c'est vraiment, on peut dire, c'est une étude de corpus assez exploratoire parce que pour nous, l'important, c'est de montrer qu'on peut offrir une caractérisation entière de l'espace de réponse. Ça, c'est d'abord. Après, bien évidemment, on peut approfondir les choses. Mais pour nous, le défi, le premier défi, c'était vraiment de trouver un moyen d'essayer de donner une caractérisation entière de l'espace. Mais bien évidemment, comme je l'ai dit, c'est une étude corpus assez exploratoire et assez, oui, d'une manière autre un peu amateur, je crois.
Et juste une question de précision, la notation manuelle était faite en écoutant le son ou pas?
Pas parce que le BNC, c'est pas tout à fait impossible pour le BNC, mais non, normalement c'était seulement le transcript.
Alors, est-ce qu'il y a d'autres questions dans le public?
Yes, I have one question.
Sure.
First, I would like to thank you for this very interesting PowerPoint. I just wanted to ask, I think it could be very similar to what Dr. Artis asked. I just wanted to check whether we could study this also from the perspective of taking culture into perspective. For example, questions could play different roles in different cultures. Would that be a possibility to study it from this angle using the taxonomy that you had provided?
Yeah, I don't see any reason why not, in the sense that this is I mean, I guess, yeah, I mean, if I look at the classes, I would think that most of them seem pretty well. Okay, this is of course a big claim. I mean, there's some classes that seem to be fairly you would expect they're fairly kind of linguistically based rather than culturally based, like direct answer and maybe indirect answer. I mean, indirectness, of course, is something that you can imagine is actually more, has a cultural component in them. And clarification quest again is fairly linguistically based in the sense that you pretty much find in all languages, cultures, as far as I know, these kind of utterances. Some of the other things, of course, and again, so many of these classes I think are pretty culturally stable. There might be a few that are not, but yeah, I'm sure it would be very interesting to see differences. I mean, I know, for instance, that they have done that. There's some work that's been done by the people, by conversation analysts. There's a big study that was done around 2009 by Tanya Stevers and colleagues across 10 languages or so, with a fairly good wide cultural difference. And I mean, they were mainly interested for conversation analysis. The big thing is this difference between preferred and non-preferred response. And I mean, for them, the main issue is to show difference between answers and non-answers. But I do know, for instance, a study that's been done about Korean, for instance, showed quite somewhat different distributions in terms of, for instance, answers, non-answers. So yeah, I think it would be very interesting to do this on other languages. stroke, in particular, other cultures to see if there are significant differences in terms of distributions. We have some currently, I think, Zulipia, who is also in the audience, she's doing some work on using this kind of taxonomy for Uyghur. So we'll hopefully have results on that reasonably soon too.
Thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time to answer the question.
Thank you. Still have more time for some questions.
Ben, je pense qu'on a fait le tour alors.
Ben ouais. Très bien. Ben merci, merci infiniment, Jonathan.
Oui, merci beaucoup.
OK, my pleasure, mon plaisir. Merci beaucoup à tous et toutes et tous.
Donc,
j'espère bientôt vous voir un peu en présentiel.
C'est très agréable. Donc, Jonathan, tu as des messages de remerciements dans le chat, je te laisserai les lire.
OK.
Voilà. Nous, on a enregistré la session, donc le temps de faire le petit montage et on t'enverra la vidéo.
OK.
Archivage. Et puis voilà, la prochaine séance de notre séminaire, alors je l'avais il y a 5 minutes, ça va être Laurent Prévost. On vous enverra la liste, enfin on vous enverra l'annonce de cette présentation avec la date. Si Laurent Prévost, c'est le 23 mars, donc ce sera probablement à distance. Et ensuite, on aura une séance libre le 30 mars pour les membres du laboratoire, du séminaire qui veulent présenter leur recherche et discuter de leur recherche avec nous. Donc voilà. Sylvain, est-ce que tu as quelque chose à ajouter?
Non, c'était très bien.
Eh bien voilà, très bien. Donc merci tout le monde, merci donc à tous les participants, membres du labo et extérieurs. Et à la prochaine fois et merci encore Jonathan.
OK, merci beaucoup. Au revoir.
Au revoir. Bye.